Welcome to Obscure Chronicle, where we explore what life was really like in the world's lost and forgotten civilizations. Whether you're drifting off to sleep or listening with a drink in hand, settle in. And if you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the story. Now let's step back into history. Welcome to Obscure Chronicle, where we explore forgotten empires and unravel ancient lives, one civilization at a time. This is What Was It Like? A long-form journey into what it truly felt like to live in the distant worlds of the past. Today, we begin in one of the most iconic and enigmatic civilizations in human history, ancient Egypt. But before we speak of pharaohs and pyramids, we need to ask a more human question. What was it actually like to be alive in that world? What would it feel like to be born along the banks of the Nile thousands of years ago, to walk through a bustling mud-brick village, hear the chants echoing from temples, smell the sweetness of lotus and the heat of fresh bread in the sun? What would you believe about life, death, kings, the stars, and how would you find your place in it all? To understand ancient Egypt, you must begin with the Nile. The river was not just a geographic feature, it was the beating heart of civilization. Each year it flooded predictably, depositing fertile black soil along its banks. This turned an otherwise barren desert into a narrow, life-giving strip of farmland. That rhythm, flood, planting, harvest, structured the Egyptian calendar, society, and sense of time. Entire communities were built alongside its banks. Life in Egypt depended so completely on the Nile that the entire world view of its people revolved around its patterns. Without it, there was only sand and death. Egyptian civilization was unimaginably old. By the time the Great Pyramid at Giza was constructed around 2560 BCE, Egypt had already existed for centuries with a complex society, kings, tax systems, monuments, medicine, law, and art. It had long entered its Old Kingdom period, often called the Age of the Pyramids. If we time-traveled from that pyramid's completion to the reign of Julius Caesar, we would find the Roman Republic in its final days. And yet, the pyramids were already ancient by then. That's how far back this story reaches. At the top of Egyptian society stood the pharaoh, a divine ruler seen not just as a king, but as a god walking the earth, the human embodiment of Horus, son of Ra. His power was unquestioned, his word law. But Egyptian society was more than just royalty. It was built on layers, an organized system of farmers, builders, craftsmen, scribes, priests, soldiers, merchants, and laborers. Life in the city was rare. Most people lived in small, rural villages scattered along the Nile. Homes were made of sun-dried mud brick. Days were shaped by agriculture, religion, festivals, and family ties. Religion touched every aspect of life. Egyptians lived in a world saturated with gods. The sun god Ra sailed his bark across the sky each day and journeyed through the underworld at night. The myth of Osiris, who was killed and resurrected, shaped their ideas of the afterlife. Isis, Thoth, Anubis, Hathor, Sekhmet. Each god represented forces of nature, emotion, death, healing, knowledge. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were administrative centers, storehouses, schools, and laboratories. Priests wielded enormous influence, keeping both divine and earthly order. Egyptians understood the universe through the principle of Ma'at, the divine order of balance, justice, and harmony. Every action, every law, every prayer was meant to preserve it. Opposing this force was Isfet, or chaos. The pharaoh's sacred duty was to uphold Ma'at, keeping the world from slipping into disorder. Even in everyday life, Ma'at governed relationships, economics, crime, and ritual. Life was not meant to be about domination or conquest, but about preserving balance. Writing, too, played a pivotal role. With the development of hieroglyphics, Egyptians recorded their beliefs, history, trade, and rituals. Scribes who could read and write were highly respected and essential to the state. They kept tax records, chronicled wars, copied religious texts, and composed letters and poetry. Most writing was done on papyrus, but some of the most enduring texts were carved onto tomb walls and temple stones. These inscriptions have given us the words of the ancients, passed down across millennia. What's perhaps most remarkable is how much of their legacy still resonates today. From monumental architecture to the idea of the soul's journey after death, from medicinal knowledge to early astronomy, ancient Egypt continues to shape how we think, build, and believe. Its mystery endures not just because of what it achieved, but because of how much still lies buried, both literally and metaphorically, beneath layers of sand and time. As we close this first chapter, we've only just cracked open the tomb of Egyptian life. In the next episode, we'll peel back the layers of the social structure to discover who ruled, who obeyed, and how each class shaped the legacy of the Nile. This is only one civilization in a long line of ancient worlds we'll explore in this series. So stay with us, because this is What Was It Like? In ancient Egypt, society was not chaotic or random. It was highly structured, meticulously ordered, and deeply intertwined with religion, power, and cosmic balance. To understand what life was really like in this ancient world, we must explore its social pyramid, both literal and metaphorical. At the absolute peak stood the pharaoh, not just a king but a living god on earth. The pharaoh was considered the human embodiment of Horus during life and Osiris in death. He wasn't merely a ruler of people, he was the cornerstone of universal harmony. It was believed that his reign maintained Ma'at, the divine order of the universe. Every decree from the pharaoh wasn't just law. It was a cosmic act that kept the forces of chaos at bay. But the pharaoh didn't rule alone. Below him was a class of elite officials and nobles, governors, priests, and high-ranking administrators. These individuals managed vast estates, collected taxes in the form of grain, enforced the pharaoh's laws, and conducted rituals that aligned the state with the gods. Many lived in elaborate brick homes, often near temples, and enjoyed luxuries like perfumes, cosmetics, and imported goods. Education and lineage were keys to their positions. One level down, we find the scribes. In a society where writing was sacred, scribes were indispensable. They recorded everything, from harvest yields to military campaigns and legal proceedings. While not noble by birth, their literacy gave them tremendous power. Becoming a scribe required years of schooling in hieroglyphs and administration. They enjoyed legal privileges, comfort, and were rarely involved in physical labor. It is thanks to them that we know so much about ancient Egypt today. Next were the artisans and craftsmen, the builders of legacy. They were painters, stone cutters, goldsmiths, carpenters, and more. Working in specialized teams, they decorated tombs, built monuments, and crafted the everyday items of the elite. One of the best-known artisan communities was Deir el-Medina, where workers who built the royal tombs lived. Their homes were adorned with artwork, and they had access to libraries, tools, and even organized labor protests when treated unfairly. Farmers made up the vast majority of the population. Life for them revolved around the Nile River, whose flooding cycles determined planting and harvesting. Most lived in simple mud brick homes, cultivated wheat and barley, and paid taxes through grain. Their work was backbreaking, yet they formed the foundation of Egypt's economy. Despite their low status, they were spiritually connected to the land and the gods who governed nature. Then came the soldiers, many of whom came from farming backgrounds. Egypt's military was essential for protecting borders, expanding territory, and maintaining internal order. Soldiers were often rewarded with land or gold, and their service could elevate their social rank. In peacetime, they helped with construction, managed labor, or performed ceremonial duties. The priesthood held enormous influence, both religiously and economically. Priests oversaw temple rituals, maintained divine communication, and operated large temple estates with hundreds of staff. High priests could rival nobles in wealth and influence. They also dabbled in early sciences, including astronomy, medicine, and engineering, serving as some of the most educated individuals in the realm. Lastly, there were slaves, though slavery in Egypt differed from later, more brutal systems. Slaves were often war captives or those in debt. They worked in households, temples, and state projects. While lacking full freedom, some slaves were able to buy their way out of bondage or integrate into families they served. Slavery, while real, was more integrated and fluid than many realize. Social mobility, though limited, was possible. Through military service, scribal training, or religious dedication, people could rise in class. The system, though stratified, wasn't entirely fixed. Loyalty and education were keys to advancement. Ancient Egypt's social structure wasn't just about control. It was about harmony. Each role served a divine purpose in maintaining the cosmic balance of Ma'at. Just as the Nile rose and fell, and the sun traveled through the sky, so too did every Egyptian believe they had a place in the larger order. Next, we'll explore the heart of daily Egyptian existence, from family life and clothing to food and entertainment. What was it like to wake up each morning in ancient Egypt? To rise with the sun, feel the heat building on the stone streets, and step into a world filled with gods, order, labor, and celebration. Whether you were a farmer by the Nile or a noble in Thebes, daily life in ancient Egypt was structured by routine, shaped by belief, and powered by the rhythms of nature. The typical Egyptian home varied greatly depending on class. Most commoners lived in modest mud brick houses, small, single-story spaces with a few rooms and a flat roof that doubled as an extra living area during hot nights. Windows were tiny or non-existent, built to keep the scorching heat out. Furniture was minimal, maybe a low table, reed mats for sleeping, and clay jars for storage. Wealthier families, on the other hand, had multi-level homes with gardens, painted walls, tiled floors, and pools shaded by date palms. Inside, one might find cushioned benches, wooden beds, and altars to domestic gods. Daily routines began early. Egyptians typically rose at sunrise. Wealthy citizens might bathe, apply scented oils to protect against the sun and insects, and dress in fine white linen robes or pleated kilts. For everyone else, clothing was practical and plain, simple wraps of linen for both men and women. Children often wore nothing at all until adolescence, and body adornment was universal. Beaded necklaces, protective amulets, and sometimes even makeup. Especially the iconic kohl eyeliner that both beautified and shielded the eyes from the sun's glare. Breakfast was humble but sustaining. Most began the day with bread made from emmer wheat or barley, paired with onions, dates, and beer, a thick fermented drink brewed from half-baked loaves. Beer was safer to drink than water and essential in all homes. The elite might enjoy added luxuries, honey-sweetened pastries, pomegranates, figs, and occasionally meat from ducks or cattle. Work dominated the day. The majority of Egyptians were farmers, bound to the agricultural calendar dictated by the flooding of the Nile. Inundation season meant preparation and waiting. Once the waters receded, they planted in the rich silt left behind. Harvest season was all hands on deck, requiring cooperation between families and villages. Tools were simple: wooden plows pulled by oxen, hand sickles, and baskets for collecting grain. Taxes were paid in kind. often collected directly by the pharaoh's officials. Those not working the fields were involved in crafts, construction, trade, or religious service. Artisans, from stone carvers to metalworkers, lived in state-supported communities like Deir el-Medina. Their lives, though demanding, were relatively secure. Their work decorated tombs, temples, and palaces. Merchants operated stalls in open-air markets, trading goods like pottery, cloth, and spices. Others transported goods via boats on the Nile, the vital artery of Egypt's economy. Women's roles were essential and varied. In most households, they managed the domestic sphere, grinding grain, baking bread, weaving textiles, raising children, and brewing beer. But this didn't limit them. Women could own property, inherit land, run businesses, and even initiate divorce. Some became priestesses in temple service, musicians, or healers. In elite families, women had influence behind the scenes, particularly in managing estates and arranging marriages that strengthened alliances. Children were cherished. They played with toys made of wood and clay, dolls, balls, animal figures. Boys might accompany their fathers to the fields or workshops, while girls learned household skills from their mothers. For the privileged few, education began early. Sons of scribes or nobles attended temple schools, where they memorized religious texts, copied manuscripts, and practiced penmanship on shards of limestone or pottery called ostraca. Mastery of hieroglyphs was a path to power. While work filled the day, community life brought balance. Egyptian villages and cities buzzed with activity. Markets were central gathering places where goods were bought, bartered, and discussed. There was no coinage for most of Egypt's history. Instead, transactions were based on goods: grain, oil, pottery, livestock. Market stalls offered linen cloth, sandals, dried fish, beer, and jewelry. Merchants shouted to advertise their wares, while musicians and storytellers entertained passers-by. Temples were not only places of worship, they were economic and administrative hubs. They employed thousands: laborers, priests, scribes, gardeners, butchers, brewers. Many Egyptians worked indirectly for the temple economy, producing food and goods that supported offerings to the gods and the temple elite. Visiting a temple was part of life, whether to pray, leave an offering, or consult a priest about health, omens, or dreams. Religion was woven into every action. Egyptians believed the gods influenced health, weather, fertility, and even daily fortune. Most homes had a household shrine, often to the goddess Taweret, protector of childbirth, or Bes, guardian of the home. Offerings of bread, flowers, beer, and incense were common. Protective amulets were worn to ward off disease and bad luck. Superstition shaped behavior, from avoiding certain foods to honoring lucky days on the calendar. Festivals brought color and celebration to life. These were community-wide events with food, music, dancing, and religious processions. Some honored the gods, like the Opet festival in Thebes, when statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were paraded on boats down the Nile. Others marked seasonal cycles, harvests, the Nile's flooding. People sang hymns, wore elaborate costumes, and shared feasts with neighbors. It was a time of unity, indulgence, and joy. When the workday ended, usually around sunset, families returned home for their evening meal. Dinner was heartier than breakfast: bread, beans, vegetables like lentils or leeks, and occasionally meat or fish. In wealthier households, servants prepared meals while the family dined in courtyards under the open sky. Oil lamps and torches provided light as shadows stretched across the walls. Evenings were social. People gathered to tell stories, play board games like Senet, or enjoy music from flutes, harps, and lutes. Some practiced divination, reading omens in fire or dreams. Children listened to myths of Osiris, Horus, and Ra, tales passed from generation to generation. Laughter and music softened the wear of the day, and for a time, even the hardest laborers could rest under the stars with family by their side. And yet, across all social classes, life was never far from the presence of death. Every Egyptian, peasant, or pharaoh prepared for the afterlife. Daily acts were considered sacred, shaping one's eternal fate. Death was not feared, but planned for. Tomb goods were carefully selected, funerary texts memorized, and rituals followed throughout life to ensure the soul's successful journey. Daily life in ancient Egypt was not merely survival. It was a tapestry of tradition, devotion, labor, and joy. Each person, from farmer to high priest, moved through the world with purpose, shaped by an invisible thread of cosmic order and timeless legacy. In the next chapter, we turn fully toward that spiritual world. We'll explore the religions, gods, and mythologies that defined Egyptian identity, and how belief shaped both life and death. Ancient Egypt was a land steeped in the sacred. Religion was not a separate part of life. It was life itself. Every action, from planting crops to building monuments, was infused with religious meaning. To understand what daily life was like in this great civilization, we must step into its spiritual world, a realm of gods, rituals, myths, and an unshakable belief in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed in a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses, each embodying forces of nature, cosmic principles, or human qualities. The supreme god was often considered to be Ra, the sun god, who journeyed across the sky every day, battling darkness to bring light and life to the world. But the gods were many, from Isis, the mother goddess and protector, to Osiris, lord of the underworld, and Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship and the sky. Temples were the earthly homes of these deities, and priests were the intermediaries between humans and gods. Priests performed daily rituals, offering food, incense, and prayers to statues representing their gods. These rituals were believed to sustain the gods' power and ensure the balance of Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and justice that held the universe together. Religious festivals punctuated the year, filling the calendar with celebrations that combined the sacred with the communal. The Opet festival in Thebes, for example, was a grand procession that reinforced the divine right of pharaohs, connecting the living ruler to the gods through elaborate ceremonies. The Festival of the Valley honored the dead, inviting families to commune with their ancestors at the necropolises. Central to Egyptian belief was the concept of the afterlife. Death was seen as a transition rather than an end. Egyptians believed that the soul would journey through the dangerous underworld, facing trials and judgment before reaching eternal life. To prepare, elaborate burial customs developed. Tombs were stocked with goods, food, and spells from the Book of the Dead, designed to guide and protect the deceased. Magic, or Heka, was another cornerstone. It was thought to be a divine force that humans could harness for protection, healing, and controlling natural and supernatural forces. Amulets, spells, and rituals were common tools in everyday life to guard against evil spirits and misfortune. Religion was also deeply personal. Most Egyptians worshipped household gods and made daily offerings in small shrines. Family tombs and funerary rituals maintained a connection between the living and the dead, binding generations in a cycle of remembrance and reverence. Belief in gods was inseparable from politics. Pharaohs were considered gods on earth, divine rulers appointed to maintain Ma'at. Their authority was religious as much as political. Building temples, commissioning statues, and performing religious rites were acts of power, ensuring the favor of the gods and the stability of the kingdom. Through temples, myths, and daily worship, religion shaped every facet of Egyptian life. It was a force that ordered the cosmos, defined morality, and promised eternal hope beyond death. In the next chapter, we will explore the art and architecture of ancient Egypt, the masterpieces that have stood the test of time, telling stories in stone and color. To walk through ancient Egypt was to walk through a living canvas, a world etched in stone, painted with myth and built to last for eternity. Art and architecture were not just decorative or aesthetic pursuits. They were expressions of power, belief, memory, and identity. Every temple wall, every statue, every carved glyph was a message to the gods, to the people, and to time itself. Let's begin with the architecture. Monumental and precise, it shaped the Egyptian landscape and continues to awe modern eyes. The earliest forms of Egyptian architecture were humble mud brick homes and mastaba tombs, but as the civilization evolved, it developed architectural mastery that produced some of the most iconic structures in human history. Most famous of all, of course, are the pyramids, immense tombs built for the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom. The Pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, built in the 27th century BCE by the architect Imhotep, was the first step pyramid, a revolutionary concept that merged traditional mastaba design with vertical ambition. Then came the Great Pyramids at Giza, with Khufu's pyramid standing as the tallest man-made structure in the world for over 3,800 years. These were not merely tombs. They were colossal affirmations of divine power, meant to launch kings into the afterlife with all the glory they had on earth. But pyramids were only the beginning. Temples became the heartbeat of Egyptian cities. Structures like Karnak and Luxor were sprawling complexes that housed gods and priests, decorated with massive columns, obelisks, and pylons. These temples were built with such precision that their axes aligned with celestial events, such as the solstice or the flooding of the Nile. Each temple had an inner sanctum, a holy of holies, where the god's statue resided, accessible only to the high priest and the pharaoh. Now consider the art, striking, symbolic, and remarkably consistent across centuries. Egyptian art was not concerned with realism as we define it today. Instead, it aimed to depict eternal truths. Figures were shown in profile with eyes and torsos facing forward, a composite view meant to portray the ideal form, not the actual one. Scale indicated importance. The larger a figure, the more significant their role. Wall paintings, especially in tombs, were designed not for the living but for the dead. They depicted daily life, rituals, and divine encounters, all intended to accompany and assist the soul in the afterlife. The use of color was symbolic: green for life and rebirth, red for chaos or vitality, gold for the divine. Many pigments were made from crushed minerals, some of which were as valuable as jewels. Sculpture was equally symbolic. From small amulets to massive seated statues of Pharaoh Ramses II, Egyptian sculpture was characterized by order, symmetry, and permanence. Statues often held an object, a crook, a staff, or an ankh, each with spiritual meaning. Many were carved from hard stone like granite or basalt, not because it was easy to work with, but because it would last forever. The goal was endurance, to preserve identity across the gulf of eternity. Even everyday items, pottery, tools, furniture, were often adorned with artistic flourishes. This was a culture where art was not a luxury but a necessity, embedded into the very structure of life. Beauty was part of function. Harmony and proportion were reflections of ma'at, the divine balance that Egyptians sought to mirror in all things. We must not forget the artisans themselves, the skilled workers of Deir el-Medina, who carved and painted the tombs of kings. These craftsmen were literate, respected, and closely tied to temple institutions. They left behind graffiti and letters that show their humanity, complaints about food rations, praise for a beautiful wife, or prayers to the gods. Through their hands, Egypt's vision of immortality became physical reality. Egyptian art and architecture were not meant to evolve, but to endure. And endure they did. Millennia later, their statues still stand. Their temples still rise from the sand. Their paintings still tell stories in colors untouched by time. In the next chapter, we'll turn to another cornerstone of Egyptian life: warfare and politics. How did Egypt rise to power? How did it defend itself, expand, and sometimes fall? Ancient Egypt is often imagined as a peaceful land of pyramids, gods, and golden tombs. But beneath that image was a world of political maneuvering, shifting alliances, and the ever-present threat of war. From internal power struggles to invasions by foreign empires, Egypt's survival across millennia was not an accident. It was the result of complex political systems and, when needed, military strength. At the heart of this system stood the pharaoh, not just a king, but a living god. The pharaoh was seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus, and upon death became one with Osiris, lord of the afterlife. This divine status gave the pharaoh absolute power over Egypt's politics, religion, and military. Yet no pharaoh ruled alone. Egypt's bureaucracy was vast and highly organized, with viziers, governors, scribes, and temple officials managing everything from taxation to irrigation. Egypt's government was centralized, especially during periods of strong dynastic rule like the Old and New Kingdoms. Viziers, essentially prime ministers, oversaw the administration of justice, infrastructure, and state records. Scribes, one of the most respected classes in society, were the engines of this system. They kept meticulous records: land ownership, grain yields, legal proceedings, and military logistics. But Egyptian politics were not always stable. Periods known as intermediate periods were times of decentralization, foreign rule, or civil strife. These transitions often followed the collapse of dynasties or economic hardships. In some cases, local governors gained too much power and challenged the authority of the pharaoh. At other times, Egypt faced external threats that forced it into political transformation. Which brings us to warfare, something Egypt, for all its emphasis on harmony and divine order, engaged in frequently. Early Egyptian conflicts were mostly civil, between rival cities or factions, but as Egypt grew into a regional power, it began to wage campaigns beyond its borders. Military power became essential for defending the Nile Valley and projecting influence into Nubia, Libya, Canaan, and beyond. The New Kingdom, circa 1550–1070 BCE, marked the golden age of Egyptian military might. Pharaohs like Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramesses II led massive expeditions into Asia and Africa, capturing territory, wealth, and prisoners of war. Egyptian armies were composed of archers, infantry, spearmen, and charioteers. The introduction of the horse-drawn chariot, likely from the Hyksos invaders, revolutionized Egyptian tactics. Chariots became symbols of royal power and battlefield dominance. Ramesses II's Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites around 1274 BCE was one of the most famous military engagements of the ancient world. Though tactically inconclusive, it was portrayed by Egyptian propaganda as a glorious victory, with temple walls covered in heroic depictions of the pharaoh leading his men into battle. Egyptian soldiers were usually conscripted farmers, though there were also professional units, especially during the New Kingdom. The military also included foreign mercenaries, Nubians, Libyans, and later Sea peoples. Warfare wasn't just about conquest, it was also a way to gain tribute, slaves, and prestige. Captured enemies were brought back to Egypt, paraded as signs of the pharaoh's divine power. Politics and religion were tightly entwined. Temples were not only spiritual centers, but also economic and administrative powerhouses. The Amun priesthood in Thebes became so wealthy and influential during the New Kingdom that they rivaled the pharaohs themselves. In some periods, they effectively ruled Egypt, leading to tensions between crown and clergy. As Egypt declined in the late New Kingdom and beyond, political fragmentation made it vulnerable to foreign powers. The Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, and later the Persians all controlled Egypt at various times. Each brought changes, new weapons, administrative reforms, and cultural influences. But none erased Egypt's unique identity. Ultimately, Egypt's final rulers were the Ptolemies, Greek-speaking monarchs descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. The most famous, Cleopatra VII, attempted to restore Egyptian independence through diplomacy and alliance, most notably with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But her death marked the end of pharaonic rule, and Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire in 30 BCE. And yet, even under foreign rule, the echoes of Egypt's old political and religious systems lingered. Temples still operated, old gods were still worshipped, and the legacy of pharaohs continued to inspire rulers for centuries. Politics and warfare shaped the borders and bloodlines of ancient Egypt, but they also shaped its legacy. Every treaty, every battle, every royal decree added to the long, intricate history of a civilization that for more than 3,000 years stood among the greatest the world has ever known. In the next chapter, we'll look at the other side of power, the collapse of it. We'll explore the fall of ancient Egypt and the many forces that brought a mighty empire to its knees. Every civilization, no matter how mighty, eventually faces decline. Egypt, the land of gods, pyramids, and pharaohs, lasted longer than almost any other in human history. For over 3 millennia, it rose, fell, and reinvented itself, clinging to the Nile like a ribbon of life. But even this great civilization, so seemingly eternal, was not immune to the pressures of time, invasion, and internal decay. So what was it like when Egypt began to fall? The decline wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unraveling, one that took centuries. While Egypt had known instability before, during its first and second intermediate periods, it always rebounded. But after the New Kingdom, starting around 1070 BCE, something changed. The unity that had defined earlier dynasties began to fracture, and the forces pulling Egypt apart became too strong to resist. One major factor was economic strain. The cost of empire, maintaining armies, building temples, and funding vast bureaucracies, drained Egypt's resources. Gold from Nubia and tribute from conquered lands became less reliable. Trade routes shifted. Famine, drought, and the increasingly unpredictable flooding of the Nile led to food shortages and civil unrest. A weaker economy meant a weaker state, one that could no longer afford its own ambitions. Then came foreign invasions. Starting with the Libyans, who had long settled in Egypt's western delta, foreign dynasties began to seize control. The Third Intermediate Period, c. 1070–664 BCE, saw a fragmentation of Egypt into rival kingdoms. The power of the pharaoh diminished as high priests of Amun in Thebes ruled the south, while warlords and foreign chieftains controlled the north. Soon, Egypt found itself under the sway of even greater powers. The Kushites, a Nubian people to the south, invaded and established Egypt's 25th dynasty, briefly reuniting the country under foreign but deeply Egyptianized rulers. They restored old temples and traditions, presenting themselves as saviors of Egyptian culture. But their time was brief. The Assyrians, ruthless conquerors from Mesopotamia, swept in from the east and shattered the Nubian rule, sacking cities and asserting dominance over the region. By the 7th century BCE, Egypt was caught in the middle of a geopolitical storm. It was no longer a superpower, it was a pawn. The Persian Empire conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, treating it as a satrapy or province within its vast holdings. Though Persian rule was sometimes light, it marked a clear end to Egypt's independence. Then, in 332 BCE, came Alexander the Great. To many Egyptians, he was seen as a liberator, someone who drove out the Persians. But his arrival also marked the beginning of a new era, the Ptolemaic dynasty, where Greek rulers, beginning with Ptolemy I, governed Egypt not as pharaohs of native blood, but as foreign monarchs using Egyptian traditions to legitimize their rule. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt remained rich and influential. Cities like Alexandria became centers of learning, trade, and culture. But it was no longer the Egypt of the pyramids. It was a hybrid world, Greek and Egyptian at once. The Ptolemies, especially in their later generations, were plagued by infighting, corruption, and declining influence. Their most famous ruler, Cleopatra VII, tried to restore Egypt's greatness through diplomacy, aligning herself with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. But Rome had already set its eyes on Egypt. In 30 BCE, after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, Egypt became a Roman province. It was the final, irrevocable end of Egypt as an independent kingdom. Even under Roman rule, Egyptian culture persisted. The temples of Philae still echoed with prayers to Isis. Hieroglyphs were still carved, and the ancient calendar still guided the seasons. But over the next few centuries, the old ways slowly faded. Christianity spread through the empire, temples were closed, and the last hieroglyphic inscriptions were carved in the 4th century CE. Egypt had not vanished. Its people, its land, and much of its culture endured. But the civilization that once crowned god-kings, built wonders for eternity, and wrote in the language of pictures, was gone. The fall of Egypt wasn't just the end of a civilization, it was the end of an era. The closing chapter of one of humanity's longest and most extraordinary stories. Yet in many ways it never truly died. The pyramids still rise from the desert. The gods still gaze from museum glass. The language, the art, the architecture, they echo still, whispering from the past. This was Egypt, and this is what it was like. When we speak of ancient Egypt, we're not just speaking of the past. We're speaking of a legacy that continues to shape the present. Though the temples have faded and the language is long dead, Egypt's influence has endured through thousands of years, crossing cultures, continents, and centuries. Few civilizations have left as wide and lasting a mark on the world. So what did Egypt leave behind? Architecture, for one, remains its most visible legacy. The Great Pyramids of Giza, over 4,500 years old, are still among the most visited and studied monuments in the world. They've inspired everything from Greco-Roman temples to modern-day memorials and cityscapes. Obelisks, once carved to honor the gods and kings, now stand in the heart of Paris, London, Rome, and even Washington, D.C., symbols of awe, power, and permanence. Art and symbolism from ancient Egypt continue to appear in everything from jewelry to fashion, album covers, and movies. The Eye of Horus, the Ankh, the scarab beetle, all of these symbols were once sacred emblems of protection, life, and transformation. Today, they decorate skin as tattoos and are worn as charms, often with only a fragment of their ancient meaning, but still carrying mystique. Then there's the influence on religion and spirituality. Egyptian mythology, with its pantheon of gods, its cycles of death and rebirth, and its belief in cosmic order, deeply shaped the spiritual frameworks of the ancient Mediterranean world. Concepts like divine kingship, judgment after death, and the soul's journey found their way into later religious systems. Even the Christian idea of eternal life echoes themes from Egypt's Book of the Dead. In science and mathematics, Egypt made profound contributions, particularly in medicine, astronomy, and engineering. Ancient Egyptian physicians practiced surgery, documented diseases, and developed herbal treatments that would later influence Greek and Islamic medicine. Their calendar, based on the heliacal rising of Sirius and the solar year, helped shape modern timekeeping. Egypt also had an impact on the written word. Although hieroglyphs became unreadable after the decline of ancient Egyptian religion, their rediscovery through the Rosetta Stone sparked one of history's greatest linguistic breakthroughs. When Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code in the 19th century, a forgotten world opened again, one where scribes recorded laws, dreams, love letters, and divine hymns in symbols that now speak to us across time. The fascination with ancient Egypt, what we now call Egyptomania, has resurfaced again and again. During Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, during the construction of Cleopatra's Needle in London, and again in the 1920s after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. That golden mask became the symbol of a civilization glinting with the mystery and glamour of an age thought lost to time. But the legacy of Egypt isn't just its wonders, it's its message. The civilization of the Nile teaches us about resilience, imagination, and the human desire for meaning. It shows us how art, belief, and governance can intertwine. It shows us how a culture can strive to make life and death part of one continuous story. And perhaps that's why it continues to draw us in. In every block of hieroglyphs, in every colossal statue and faded wall painting, we find not only the traces of the past, but reflections of ourselves. Our desire to be remembered, our need for order in chaos, our hope that what we build, what we love, what we believe, will last. So what was it like to live in ancient Egypt? It was to live in a world shaped by gods and pharaohs, sun and stone, ritual and power. It was to live at the center of one of the world's oldest and most visionary civilizations, a place where life flowed like the Nile, slow and eternal. Thank you for joining us in this journey through time. This has been What Was It Like? And there are many more civilizations to explore. Thanks for joining us on this journey through time. If you enjoyed it, please like the video, subscribe to Obscure Chronicle, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. More forgotten worlds and ancient lives are just around the corner. Until then, stay curious.